Well, let's get talking now. Availability of public power supply continues to pose challenges on different fronts in Nigeria. For many decades, successive administrations have made concerted efforts to tackle many challenges that had plagued the sector. However, it appears every solution preferred has thus far failed at almost the first hurdle. The unbundling of the erstwhile Power Holding Company of Nigeria and the substantial privatization of the power sector have still missed the mark in reviving the sector and finally providing a lasting solution to many challenges that plagued the sector. Some of the economic challenges being faced in Nigeria continue to be attributed to shortcomings of the power sector, especially the generation, distribution of electricity. Hence, although there has been some noticeable improvements, which are unarguably not far-reaching, there continue to be divergent views on what might be, if any, silver bullet to turning things around. That's for good in the sector. Let's understand the present discussion around state legislation of electricity generation, transmission, and distribution, and what it holds for Nigeria's power sector. Dr. Ayodele Oni is an energy lawyer and analyst. He puts up a write-up immediately after this legislation has popped up to address some of the contending issues and make them clearer for the public. He's joining us via Zoom to talk more about it. Dr. Oni, good afternoon. It's good to have you on the program.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Oni, let's start with the understanding of Nigeria's electricity market and what this legislation means. What's the addition? What's the subtraction in all of this?
Okay, thank you very much. First things first, many people misunderstand that amendment. That amendment only simply gives states power to make laws around generation and transmission in areas where the grid system extends to. What wasn't the case prior to this time. It doesn't necessarily say they can create new markets. Of course, the impact is that they can then make legislation to create electricity markets. Now, a few points, if you don't mind, in 1 or 2 minutes.
Go ahead.
A lot of people have argued that we do not even have an electricity market in Nigeria or we need more. I do not agree, because a market, whether physical or virtual, is just a platform for people to buy and sell goods and services. And you typically have rules. And that's what we have in Nigeria. We have NERC making rules. We have the wholesale market where we have generation companies sell ultimately to distribution companies through the transmission network, which is like the shipper. And you have the transmission company ship that electricity, distribution companies. And then you have the retail market, distribution to you and I. So I think we have an electricity market. You can debate whether it works, you can debate efficiency, and then we do not even need more electricity markets now. What I think should be done is a situation where you would have state governments make legislation around the last mile, around distribution, such that you have distribution infrastructure as conduits. And retailers can then, you and I, as consumers, the last mile would have a choice of who are retail satisfied with the consumer experience, then we can choose another retailer. I'm not sure having different markets will not create chaos in the market as it is. Because, for example, if you take transmission naturally lends itself to federal legislation. If you speak to regional markets, you will be speaking of advanced situations. What happens with the current legislation? I think what we should really be doing is to look at the legislation we have now and determine those that are working, those that aren't, and situations where we have overregulation. Why isn't the market working? If you have a market and there's indiscipline, then you change things around, not create additional markets and have 36 or 37 markets that are all not working. I think that's what would ultimately happen. I think it's a good idea generally, but the devil usually is in the details and implementation.
Now let's go to NERC, that I understand as the regulator. where will next sit in all of this if states like Lagos, Ondo, Delta, and all of them decide to start to control maybe distribution from their end? Where will next sit in all of this?
Okay, so NERC, in my view, should continue to regulate generation and transmission. Distribution should then go to, and I think constitutionally, states have always had the powers around distribution. People always just misunderstood that portion of the Constitution. First, generation and transmission were always in the concurrent legislative list. However, each level of government had its own specific powers. Even though electricity was in the concurrent legislative list, the state had the extent of its powers, the federal did. Now, I think federal should continue to regulate transmission and in collaboration with states, and federal being NERC, to continue to regulate generation. But when it comes to the last mile, when it comes to satisfying you and I, it should then be the states. They should make laws like what you have abroad. You hear people say, oh, I didn't like that retailer, so I'm using someone else who's supplying me electricity. So it will be third-party access. It will be everybody having access.
Dr. Ayodele Oni there will definitely try to reconnect so that we can continue this very important conversation around state legislation to generate power. What does it really mean? Do they have the capacity? How well are they going to work with the present regulators to achieve stable power, at least to a level? That is what we are trying to understand here now. Dr. Oni, are you back?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, yes.
Okay, so I was saying NERC should continue to regulate generation and transmission, but with respect to distribution, I think that the states can work with the private sector around reducing electricity theft with technology, around ensuring that customer experience is excellent, around ensuring that
well, indeed, it's really a challenging day with network.
States should concentrate on the last mile distribution, and you and I, not generation and transmission. I think that should be left with NERC, because by nature, transmission lends itself to federal legislation and regulation. That's my view.
Well, let's move forward very quickly to understand more around this. I want us to speak around the challenges, because most of these challenges still remain. You've mentioned one: energy theft, tariff issues, infrastructure issues. All of the investors that came in since privatization, they have not been able to perform excellently as expected. When we rate it in a percentage form, I don't know what you do. You understand this more than I do. So what do we do about the present challenges? Are we going to continue to grapple with it, despite the fact that we still have a legislation that should support states from power generation?
Okay, that's a good question. That's why, and many people complain. I think there's no problem with generation. If generation companies have a line of sight to getting their revenues, we would have more power than we need in terms of generation. The problem is around transmission and distribution. And one of the key things around distribution will be market indiscipline, will be infrastructural problems, will be lack of funds, will be electricity theft. So legislation by states should tackle those. Whilst government, like what government is doing with the Siemens deal, is good. Government works on transmission and ensures that we have sufficient capacity around transmission. If we can do those two, we will make progress, because there's definitely no problem around generation. Gas has been a problem, but it's been a problem because of the commercial arrangement. If electricity tariffs are not good enough, remember, gas is a pass-through in electricity generation. If the tariffs aren't good enough, they wouldn't be able to pay for gas, and no one's going to invest in gas. If the tariffs are good and it covers gas, and people pay, you and I pay for electricity, we would have no problem across the value chain from gas supply to generation. The transmission is strengthened. Then distribution, the states deal with distribution, the last mile, retailing. and franchising, and then we'll be home and dry. And then the NERC works with, and states can also deal with rural electrification issues, energy federalism, encourage the use of biomass, of coal. I mean, I know there are issues around energy transition. For areas where we have competitive advantage, in Enugu, maybe use coal. In Kano, maybe use solar. In Lagos, small hydro. So that's what states should do. They should encourage certain kinds of generation and embed generation within distribution networks. That's what states should be looking to do, because a lot of these regulations already exist. We have a market, but we need to strengthen that market, not create new problems for ourselves.
Dr. Oni, let's move to the eligible customer. At the time, we had this scheme introduced by the then minister before at that time, Babatunde Radi Fashola, talking about willing buyer, willing seller, eligible customer thing and all of that. You explained that better to us. But I learned at that time that the likes of this Araira market, I think in Anambra, was powered by solar. Sura market in Lagos, also powered at the moment, I think is by solar. There's also a market in Kano. I can go on like that the government tried to pull away from the grid. Now, do we still have all of this available? Because that would also help free this grid that we know cannot satisfy us as a country.
Interestingly, advised on the Sura deal, I think there was also Sabongeri, and there was one in the East. Advised on aspects of those deals. So I think fantastic idea. Issue usually is around implementation. Some of that is still in place. It's just ensuring from a pricing perspective and its scale. You need to scale, because electricity is such that if fewer people, be more expensive. So you need a larger number of people to be able to benefit. And it goes to our energy mix. So I think it's that sort of thing we should see states support. Support guys coming to generate in their states, to work with distribution companies to be able to distribute, to be able to ensure that the pricing is right, and distribution. So it's distributed generation is what states should be looking at. States should be looking at rural electrification and around distribution. So that's one thing, the rural electrification, and I think it was something done by the Rural Electrification Agency. That's one of their initiatives. So it's just sort of initiatives we should see with states working with NERC. So the eligible customer arrangement, there were challenges, and if we don't deal with those challenges, we'll only be replicating them by creating additional markets. I'll tell you some of the challenges. Some who wanted to do it were owing discos, and without getting a clear from the disco or a clearance from the disco, NERC wasn't going to issue them licenses to go ahead. So those are some of the issues. That was a key issue around that eligible, and issues around gas also. So if we don't deal with these issues, we just create multiple problems, same challenges, just multiplied.
Doctor, it's getting really interesting now, but I'll take you again to issue of gas pricing and not paying for the gas. The gas suppliers will tell you the big boys have the gas and they ain't paying us the dollars. So they have to wait for some time before we get the dollars. But that's on one side. Transmission will tell you, I can do 12,000. I can do 8,000. Discos will tell you, this is what we can receive and distribute, because they also have to be accountable for what they receive. Will all of this change with this new scheme?
Okay, so it's implementation. And I'll tell you the challenge. You see that transmission will blame distribution. No one really blames generation, save for gas issues, and save that generation companies feel they won't get their money, so they don't want to exert themselves. Transmission blames distribution. Distribution blames you and I. So distribution companies will say, you know what, I will reject. Of course, a regulation was later issued that if you reject power, there was punishment and all of that around that. So they would reject because they say if we send power to certain areas, they will not pay. And transmission will say we have the power, but distribution companies are not taking. So it's two things. If poor infrastructure, energy theft too. And at the time of privatization, a number of these companies actually couldn't really afford those assets. They borrowed hugely or heavily, they were highly leveraged, and then when it was time to improve infrastructure, they couldn't improve infrastructure. Whilst I would not blame the last administration for what they did in terms of privatization, I think it was a brilliant idea. I think there were issues around the sort of people who participated in that process. Not all of them, but quite a number of them. And some of them have lost those assets already. So it's market discipline from you and I. It's market discipline from distribution. Otherwise, no one wants to generate electricity, sell, and not be able to get paid. That's where the challenge is, getting paid, liquidity in the market, and issues around infrastructure, metering, electricity theft. I think if those issues are dealt with and state regulators or state governments or legislators can work with NERC, I think we can make progress. It's one of collaboration more than creating various markets with various problems being replicated.
Interesting stuff. But the ultimate achievement is to improve supply. That's what Nigerians want. They believe that steady supply. They don't want to even know where it comes from at times. All they want is supply, and they are ready to pay. So where does the cost-reflective tariff fall in all of this argument too? Because some will believe that we might have to pay more if we want the states to totally take charge. Do you think we're ready for that?
Well, I think we're ready for that, and I'll give you a scenario. You know, when you power your home with generators, diesel, petrol, and you know the I Pass My Neighbor, you're probably paying, if it's petrol, you're probably paying, because of subsidy, 80 naira per kilowatt hour. That's higher than what we currently have, even under service reflective tariffs. You know, you see 65, maybe 70 something. You're paying 80 naira. If it's diesel, you're paying upwards of 200 naira per kilowatt hour compared to the 65, 70, 80 you will pay. So at the end of the day, even the poor can afford it. They just don't understand. Because going to buy fuel, you're spending much more than if you had steady power. So one, people can pay. I think our people are ready. The problem is chicken and egg. The business people running those utilities will say, we want higher tariffs first. The people will say, no, we want to see that there's stable electricity before we pay the tariffs. Well, I think there's a middle ground. Middle ground is in having assurances that things would improve clearly, and we see that things are improving. And then tariffs should actually be service reflective and service based. That's what NEC currently does. So that if you enjoy electricity for a number of hours, your own tariffs are higher than someone else. So I think everyone can afford electricity in Nigeria reasonably, especially if we're also very efficient. We can afford it. It's cheaper than buying fuel, actually, at the end of the day. And that's something government has to do to remove subsidy. Ensure we have stable public electricity.
Dr. Ayodele Oni, I totally agree with you. And I must commend you. Beautiful write-up there you put up with regards to this state legislation. We'll keep a tab on all of these discussions. And as events unfold, we expect the new administration to take charge, take advantage of all of these openings. And all we need is to make things better for the whole, everyone across the country. I must thank you so much, Dr. Ayodele Oni. It's always interesting having you discuss the power sector with us on the show. He's an energy lawyer and an analyst. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me. Enjoy your day too.